Good afternoon, and thanks very much for coming. Je vous souhaite une très chaleureuse bienvenue et je remercie beaucoup le personnel de la bibliothèque Atwater. I thank too Barbara Silverberg for donating a copy of the book to the library, and as well our neighbor when we lived on Clark Avenue, Salvatore Carboneto, donated a copy to the Westmount Library. So in terms of publicly available copies, we're in good shape. I say that simply because it's an attractive proposition to own a copy of this book until you find out how much is being charged for it. I think I've got everything underway here. Jason, if I don't hesitate to interrupt me. Thank you. I want to talk to you about an artist named Paul Kane. Maybe I can advance this by... I probably failed one of the steps.
This menu's up.
Once that menu's up.
Next one, because you want to go right?
Got it. Thank you. I'm showing you a self-portrait on the left of Paul Kane, an artist who was born in Ireland and came to North America to the town of York, which of course underwent a name change to Toronto after he was a boy there. He was about 9 years of age when he came from Ireland, and his father wouldn't educate him. So the reason for that was that he wanted to be a painter, and his father did not consider that a respectable occupation. So he refused to educate Paul, and as a result, the artist Paul only wrote phonetically and trained himself in terms of his ability to sketch. That made him an autodidact, essentially. He didn't take any instruction. There's a myth about him having received it as a boy, and that was simply an aspect of building up this person to make him famous. But that didn't occur in Toronto either. He was not on good terms with his father, and he left Toronto in the early 1830s and traveled on the Mississippi River. He could make a living sketching portraits of businessmen in the era just before the advent of photography, when that would have made it impossible. But usually prosperous, successful people wanted their portraits painted, and that's how Kane made a living. We don't have many examples of that work, and he never signed his art, so it's very difficult to track that down. Paul Kane traveled in the 1840s from Toronto all the way to the Pacific Ocean and back. He did not travel in Quebec, except once after his Western travels he came here, and I promise we'll get to Montreal before the end of the talk. A photo of him from the 1850s is on the right. He seemed to enjoy being photographed, although he often dressed up in some of the garments he collected during the course of his travels. There's a phenomenon called playing Indian, and Kane was very good at it. He was also quite a showman. His mother, being Irish, maybe gave him the gift of the blarney. He certainly was disposed to speak in public. He did that often, but he didn't read papers at the Canadian Institute in Toronto, although he's alleged to have done so. It was always his patron or someone else who wrote them and read them for him. So we're concerned here particularly about Kane in terms of his art and in terms of his writing. His writing particularly because he's famous in particular, and here's another photo of him dressed in an Inuk parka, and the kind of mountain man self-portrait that he made of himself during the course of his travels. We're concerned about him because a book appeared in 1859 with his name on it, called Wanderings of an Artist Among the Indians of North America, and it was published by the most prestigious publisher in London, England, Longmans. And so Kane gained an authority from this narrative. He didn't write it. And this actually belongs to a long history in the genre of travel writing, of people doing the traveling and then getting others to ready them into print, as the phrase was. There were two bedeviling aspects of the genre of travel writing. One was that people who could travel didn't necessarily know how to write. This is in the age before professional travel writers who took trips in order to write books. I think in particular, famously, of Dervla Murphy. You might know her work. She rode her bicycle up Africa. She crossed the Soviet Union. She is a wonderful Irish travel writer, but a professional writer. And I'm talking about the age when people traveled and weren't necessarily qualified to write a book, but the public almost always demanded one from them. So they had to produce one, and others became involved. So there's that aspect of travel writing that's bedeviling. The other bedevilment is the fact that there were always armchair authors, people who went nowhere but wrote travels. There's 120 authentic Marco Polo manuscripts. Every one of them's the original. And the first in English, the first sample of travel writing, called The Travels of Sir John Mandeville, was written by a Belgian, first in French, translated into English. But when the great Richard Hakluyt made his compilation of voyages and travels in English in Shakespeare's time in the late 16th century, he included Mandeville's travels. He thought it was authentic. So people in Asia had eyes between their shoulders instead of on their heads, and all the other stuff that was concocted. So those concoctions, plus the fact that travelers often needed help, produces a very complex genre. And so if I put you to work today, please believe me that it's only by way of orientation. What is remarkable about the Kane case is that there's 3 surviving stages of the narrative. And that seldom is the case. Usually the book gets rid of, dispenses with the previous ones. But we have, in the case of Kane, what he wrote when he traveled, then a draft manuscript written in the 1850s in Toronto, not in his hand, in 2 hands, neither of them his or his wife Harriet's, and then the book, which is different, very different again, which came out in London in 1859, and which he went to England to help oversee. Now, I'm saving you $10,000 US. You don't have to go out and buy a copy of Wanderings of an Artist, but here's one for sale on ABE Books. It's a very expensive book to acquire now, in the first edition at any rate. And so think of that. The rest of my lecture, I'm saving you all this money. Because what I did in my book was provide transcriptions of all his field writings, transcriptions of the draft manuscript, and then a facsimile of the first edition of Wanderings of an Artist. So you have, at the start of each chapter, those 3 stages of the narrative to compare. And then in the discussion portion of any chapter, I bring in all the artwork that pertains to that particular point in his travels. That's the structure of these 4 volumes, which McGill-Queen's kindly published this May after I signed a contract in 2002 with them. And I began this work in 1987. In my book, I show to scale the actual field notebooks that in which Kane did his writing. They're about 4 inches by 5 inches, and this is a picture of them. These are his only writings during the course of his travels, first in 1845, then 1846 to 8. 1845, he went up to Penetang on Georgian Bay, and then over to Saugeen on Lake Huron, and then up to Manitoulin Island through the 30,000 islands of Georgian Bay. He got to Sault Ste. Marie on his own, and the Hudson's Bay Company factor there said, you know, you're going to do a lot better, and it's going to be a lot easier on you if you go home and try and get permission from the governor of the Hudson's Bay Company. And if you do, you'll get free passage as far as you want to travel. So Kane ultimately did that. He came down to Lachine, where George Simpson wintered, and he got that permission on a kind of probationary basis. He didn't get the circular that he could take as a passport through all the fur trade posts until he got as far west in 1846 as Fort Frances, which is still there in northwestern Ontario. You might well know it. And then, having been more or less stopped at Sault Ste. Marie, he continued into Lake Michigan, went into Green Bay, up into Lake Winnebago, and to the Menominee annuity payment in October on Lake Poygan in Wisconsin Territory. It wasn't yet a state. Then in 1846, he went from Toronto to the end of Lake Superior, and then up through an intricate series of rivers and portages onto the Rainy River watershed, down it to Lake of the Woods, down Winnipeg River to Lake Winnipeg, down north, down Lake Winnipeg, and then up the Saskatchewan River all the way to Edmonton, and crossing over, are you still with me? Crossing over a 5-day horse portage to Athabasca River, and up it through Jasper to the Whirlpool River, and over the Athabasca Pass and down into the Columbia River, and stayed on it all the way down to its mouth. The Fraser River wasn't navigable, really. The fur trade had already convinced itself, stopped trying to use it for anything. It's just too hazardous. Not that the Columbia River was an easy trip. So once he got to Fort Vancouver, which is Vancouver, Washington, not Vancouver, BC. Vancouver, Washington is across the Columbia River from Portland, Oregon. Then he went up the Cowlitz River through the Inside Passage to Puget Sound, down Puget Sound to Fort Victoria on Vancouver Island. That was the extent of his travels, and he more or less came home the same way. So I've used the end papers in each volume of my book to replicate images of Kane's own writings. And these are 2 pages. You don't have to read them. I'm not making you do that. But I'm going to concentrate on the passage that these 2 end papers in volume 4, the front end papers, or perhaps it's the back end papers, I forget, narrate. Then we have the draft manuscript, which is written in 4 hardback notebooks, much bigger than the field notebooks Kane kept. Very little writing in them by Kane, and the writing. Sorry, and the writing was done by 2 people I've been unable to identify the hands of, because it's round hand, which was the hand taught to all clerks in the middle of the 19th century. Could have been anyone. Kane maybe looked over the shoulder of, dictated. Someone took notes as he talked, or he wasn't that involved. He either lost or ceded control of the narrative at some point. That wasn't the case as he transformed sketches into studio canvases. That's another procedure, and I'll get to it. So that the transcriptions of these contents are in every chapter as well, using the contents of the first edition as the basis for dividing up what's in these other 2 stages. Both the draft manuscripts and the field notes are owned by the Stark Museum of Art in Orange, Texas. Lutcher Stark bought them in 1957 from Paul Kane III. Paul Kane III tried to sell the sketches he owned by his grandfather and the field writings to any museum in Canada. None of them was interested in all of them, and none of them was willing to pay what he was asking. And one of them actually snidely said, the director said, oh, he's looking for some sugar daddy in the US to take care of him. Well, he found him. Lutcher Stark bought them. The New York Times reported it. On the 23rd of September 1957, Paul Kane III drove his station wagon to Rapid City, North Dakota from Winnipeg, and Lutcher Stark drove his station wagon from Orange, Texas to Rapid City, and the exchange was made. So the best of Kane's artwork and all of his writings are in Texas, in a little museum, the easternmost city in Texas. If you go a mile east of Orange, you're in Louisiana. And they've been there and are very well cared for there at the Stark Museum of Art. And then the third stage, as I mentioned, is the book. And so the narrative proceeds from these fields writings right the way to the book in the course of 1845 to 1859. So there's a large period, 15-year period, in the evolution of the narrative. So each of the chapters of my book start with a synopsis telling you which pages of the first edition, WA means Wanderings of an Artist, are covered, what the dates of the travel are, and I'm taking you now to the last chapter, chapter 25, so June to October 1848. The place is covered in the travels from Fort Carlton, which is about an hour's drive from Saskatoon, but up on the North Saskatchewan. Saskatoon's on the South Saskatchewan River. To Norway House at the bottom north end of Lake Winnipeg itself, the Winnipeg River, Fort Francis, Fort William, Lake Superior, Sault Ste. Marie, and then back to Toronto. Every chapter starts with a synopsis, and then the field notes, then the draft manuscript, then the chapter from Wanderings of an Artist. You can tell when you've hit the field notes because I retained the line breaks. So when you see on the right-hand image, those really narrow lines, you know you're in the field notes. Nothing else in the book looks like them. And that's why I'm showing, just visually showing you that. Here, there's a page of the field notes. And now I'm going to take you to a particular section that begins on the 28th of July. You can see in the upper left-hand corner. Or can you? Can you see readily enough? Okay, thanks. And then the draft manuscript written in someone else's hand, which starts similarly being windbound on Lake Winnipeg on the 28th of July. And that's what this writing looks like, not asking you to read it. This is what the transcription looks like. We were windbound until 2 p.m. We went but a short distance and encamped at the Dog's Head. That's a place on Lake Winnipeg, now known as Buffalo Head, rather than Dog's Head. And there's the extent of it. And then these are the pages from Wanderings of an Artist. About 2 o'clock we endeavored to proceed, but only got as far as the Dog's Head. And then this is how the designer of my book, Garrett Markfort, decided to show the transcription of the first edition, so it looks a little bit like a book, and it retains the running headers at the top of pages and the page numbers and so on. So the reader's never lost in my book. And just so that you have an idea of where we are here, let me point out where Bullhead is on Lake Winnipeg. Winnipeg, the city itself, would be down here. It was Red River settlement at the time. Here's Norway House at the top, and here's the Saskatchewan River coming downriver to Cedar Lake and then into Lake Winnipeg. I'll be talking in a moment about Barons River, so I'll just point that out as well. And Kane's coming in July up Lake Winnipeg south. Remember, Winnipeg, it's fed by the Red River from North Dakota. It's one of those water systems that travels north like the Mackenzie rather than east or west. And Kane's mode of travel was in these York boats, which used sails because Lake Winnipeg was notoriously windy. And I'll show you, this is one of his sketches of the York boats. There's a photograph from the early 20th century of them under sail. And here's the transformation that Kane made in his studio. And this is a typical, I'm not exaggerating, a typical transformation of a sketch into a field picture, a studio canvas, brigade under sail, and a dramatic sky, everything he learned in one time he went to Europe and studied at on his own at the Uffizi in Florence, and he was in Venice, he was in Paris as well. But generally speaking, the typical even stereotypical aspects of such a painting are a coulisse of trees, so your vision is curtained off in most cases, and this contains the view, so the eye is shown what in particular to look for in a painting. And then the rough water, and there's no need to suggest there was exaggeration here, because Lake Winnipeg is notoriously difficult to sail because it's so shallow and the waves are so high. So it was not uncommon for a fur trade brigade to be windbound 1 or 2 or even more days at a time. So here's the field note for the 28th of July. Windbound until 2 o'clock, camped at the Dog's Head. The Indians, which our crew consisted of, made a jongleur, or medicine lodge, which consists of 8 or 10 poles being driven into the ground in a circle about 10 feet high. A circle is about 3 feet in circumference and covered with skins, obviously buffalo skins or animal skins of some kind. The medicine man gets inside with a rattle and commences his incantation to the Great Spirit. You are allowed to ask any question you think fit on paying a small piece of tobacco. The main object is to get a fair wind. After singing and shaking the lodge for about 2 hours, he announced that he saw 5 boats with their sails set, which was greeted with a grunt by those outside. I asked where the canoes of Sir John Richardson were. Of a time, he told me that he saw them at a sandy point we had passed 2 days before. Some inquired for their families, some he saw eating sturgeon, some at one thing, some at another. The major, who was the factor who was responsible for the brigade, a man named Mackenzie. They called him the major because he'd seen a little action in the Napoleonic War on the Iberian Peninsula, of which he made a great deal, and no one believed him. He told me that so his testimony is always something one takes with a grain of salt. He told me that a Canadian, which is to say a Canadien, a voyageur, had the temerity to peep under the skin of the lodge, but he got such a fright that he never got fairly over it. Next morning, we had a fair wind, which they attributed to their conjuring. And then the 29th started with a fair wind. So that's the field note. Here we come to the draft manuscript. And I'm just... no, the draft manuscript transcription. So you can see taking one of the boat sails, so now the shaking tent is covered with a sail, not with animal skins. And the medicine man, one of whom is generally found in every brigade. That's a new detail too. Is it a trustworthy one? Well, who knows? And now the poles of the tent are being shaken violently, and the singing is hoarse, and suddenly Kane himself, the persona of Kane, is unable to sleep on account of the discordant noise. Gradually, the persona of Kane, through these 3 stages, becomes scornful of and dismissive of Indigenous practices and people. We're making our way to the published persona of Kane, which essentially is repelled by Indians. And this is in the Victorian vein. No publisher is going to publish a book to lose money. And in the case of the representation of the other, the exotic other, eventually civilization does not approve. And we see gradually how this comes upon the persona of Kane. There's no mention that the poles are violently shaken. There's no mention in the field notes of the singing being hoarse. And there's no mention of any kind of disruption for Kane himself. But now he can't sleep. And so he wraps himself in a blanket and went out into the woods to where they were holding their midnight, and over to the right side. Orgies. Now it's an orgy. Now, if we look up orgy, the first 2 definitions don't apply, but the third one does. Secret rites used in the worship of Bacchus, Dionysus, and other Greek and Roman deities, celebrated with dancing, drunkenness, and singing. No mention of alcohol, but orgy, it implies, it connotes. And that's all it is. That's all it takes. Eventually, you see a pattern of this throughout the book, and Kane is finding these people, what I end up calling 5 V's Indians: vain, vengeful, vicious, violent, and ultimately vanishing because of the way they lived. And this is a steady stereotype that gets built up, despite the fact that he gets to write about wanderings of an artist among the Indians of North America. Now, because I'm going to be speaking in a couple of days on a First Nation north of Manitoulin Island, and I want to point out to the school kids that when I do the talk at the school that this is how the Indian became known to Euro-Americans and Europeans. And this is why the expectation of Indigenous people was always so low, and they needed to be rescued from themselves and the way they lived. And this is one example. Thank goodness there's 3 stages of the narrative. We can see it. There's no pejorative reference in that field note to Indigenous people that we read all of. So orgies. And then he lay down outside the medicine lodge to witness the proceedings. I had no sooner done so than the incantations at once ceased. Performer exclaimed that a white man was present. How he ascertained this fact, I'm at a loss to surmise, as it was pitch dark at the time. He has to explain all of this. Anyway, something happened. And then the major tells him, as was in the field note, that someone had the temerity to peep under the skin, which enclosed the jonglerie, but that he got such a fright that he never fairly recovered, nor could he ever be prevailed on to tell what he had seen so appalling. So that's a new detail. That's not in the field note. And after about 2 hours and on it goes. There's lots that could be commented on here, and you probably see things in this that I'm not seeing. Then a question was put to him, myself accompanying it with a double portion of tobacco. Where the hell are John Richardson's canoes? Okay. Richardson's on his way. Do you know the name? He was an Arctic explorer, and in 1848 he's on his way north to look for Franklin, with whom he did his Arctic exploring, because Franklin's gone, as are the 137 men of his 1845 voyage. No one knows where the hell they are. And Richardson volunteers, and he goes through the continent up to the north to look, and of course doesn't find them. But he happens, Lake Winnipeg was busy that summer. He crossed paths with Kane. And those canoes were coming back. It's not till the book stage that you understand why he would be interested in finding this out. But at any rate, after the fair wind arrives the next day, the medicine man was not slow in ascribing to his conjurations the fair wind. So there's a boasting aspect there that was not in, they ascribed it to the conjuring, is what the field note says. They did. Now it's the medicine man who's not slow, he's quick to take all the credit, to take the credit at any rate. Okay, now here's what the beginning of chapter 25 looks like in my book. It's with the Victorian way of, even in novels, of providing a synopsis at the start of each chapter. That was typical. And then here we have that version. Nor could he ever be prevailed upon to tell what it was that had so appalled him, is retained from the draft manuscript. Their usual grunt of satisfaction and assent is different from they grunted. And then a Canadian had the temerity to peep under the skin of the lodge, but he got such a fright that he never got fairly over it. Next morning we had a fair wind. That's back to the field note. So you can compare that with what's up here. Such a fright that he never fairly recovered, nor could he ever be prevailed. That's not in here. That's not in what Kane himself wrote. So that's how things have evolved. Here in the draft manuscript, he puts a question to the man in the tent, and with a double portion of tobacco. But here, the double portion of tobacco nets him a double portion of noise. So, and that's all it is. It's not singing, it's not prayer. At this point, it's what's keeping me from sleeping. Thank you very much. You've ruined my night. I'll ask a question to humor you. And then at the end, the medicine man took all the credit. And that's the first time that that pops up. And then because the book is trying to give you the impression that it's a field note written on the spot, you get the next day's date right away. So you're reading something that leaves you with the impression that you're reading what Kane himself wrote when he was traveling. Every one of my chapters is now followed by a discussion. It's probably 80% of the book are the discussions of each of the chapters, where I bring the field writings together for comparison, and then introduce all the pictures that pertain to those particular dates of his travels. In doing that, the designer simply gave us the page number in maroon in the margin, so you know which page is from the first edition any portion of the discussion is treating. And in it, I explain that jongler is the French verb for conjure or to juggle, and that this was an indigenous practice, widespread among most peoples in the Algonquian language as family. The ceremony, exercise, medicine, quote, sought spiritual assistance for a number of purposes, including to diagnose and treat illness, to find lost persons or objects, to determine the well-being of absent friends or relatives, and to prophesy future events. So it was common, it was not unusual, there's nothing special about this, but is it understood by Kane the persona traveler and its purpose? Based on their work on another trader named Nelson, and referring to that trader's years in the XY Company in Wisconsin, Jennifer Brown, Robert Brightman mentioned the Chippewa Indian sense that conjuring was in the circumstances, and their circumstances were enmity with Sioux, as good and useful a coping strategy as any, and more satisfying than most. I want to dwell on this for a moment. If you're living, and this is increasingly hard for us to understand, if you're living in terms of the elements and the wildlife, your world is occupied by other beings than humans in a disproportionate way, and certainly in contradistinction to the way most of us live. Most of our joys and sorrows, our pleasures and our angers issue from other humans, especially urban, those of us who are urban dwellers. If that's not the case, if you're living in what we would call wilderness, then everything takes on a life of its own, and it's not at all surprising that what Christian missionaries kept encountering were people who believed that there were spirits in trees, and there were spirits in animals and in birds, and that informed the understanding of how a day was to be lived and how a life was to be led. So in the case of the shaking tent, there was a way of coping with, especially with distress, with disease and disruption, by trying to divine what was going on, and this was a mechanism for doing it. It of course is scornfully treated by almost every white who encounters it. But on the other hand, this passage ends with even the published persona of Paul Kane saying, well, there was fair wind the next day, and sure enough, I checked, and Richardson's canoes were there. And that's good for Kane because all his collection of artifacts is with those canoes. That's why he's concerned about them, not because he's concerned for John Richardson. Beginning in the early 1930s, an anthropologist named Irving Hallowell studied Ojibwa lifeways on the Barrens River. I pointed that out on the map on the east side of Lake Winnipeg. Two of his photographs show a shaking tent accompanying one of his accounts. And I quote him, this institution, this is in my discussion, this institution channels direct contact with other than human persons of all kinds. Its purpose is to secure help from these entities by invoking their presence and communicating human desires to them. This form of conjuring, known as jisakan, had been an aspect of Indigenous cultural practice that fascinated European readers, at least since the mention of it in such 18th century sources as Jonathan Carver's Travels, published in 1776, and Samuel Hearne's Journey, published in 1795. Carver's book speaks of, quote, the person who is invested with this triple character of doctor, priest, and magician, unquote, whose roles demonstrated to Europeans that, quote, Indians seem to have little notion of the rigid divide between the two, body and soul, that had become axiomatic in European thought. So European, especially Enlightenment thinking, had driven that wedge between the two. And that just did not correspond to an understanding of a holistic animistic life. They had so little in common with one another. I think in my time as a worshiping Christian, I can count on the fingers of one hand the number of sermons I've heard about the Holy Spirit. And the mystery of Christian faith has not survived very well in the Enlightenment thinking that has dominated, even tormented it. But if you can back away from that, if you can back off to, say, Chaucer's time or even Shakespeare's, there's a much stronger sense of we don't understand aspect to one's faith. And if you look to a definition of faith in the Bible, it's the conviction of things hoped for, the assurance of things unseen. Chapter 11 of Hebrews. The assurance of things unseen. So if you go back to a different understanding of Christianity than Enlightenment has saddled us with, there's much less assurance of things only if they're seen. But by the time Kane comes along, everything's got to be empirically verifiable. Anthropology is just coming into being as a legitimate science. They're still fooling around with things like craniometry, which meant, and Kane did himself steal skulls when he was on the Columbia River from graves because people were making skull collections, thinking if you can analyze different races of skulls, you can figure out who's stupid and who isn't. And all kinds of pseudoscience still held credibility in the 1840s. Okay, well, maybe enough of that. I don't have a lot more time, so let me take you to the art. Thanks for your patience. That was the tough part. Here's a picture that Kane sketched, I should say, when he was on the Columbia Plateaus. So the interior of the state of Washington is a desert compared to the coast. You know, they talk on the coast about ecotopia, Seattle and Vancouver and so on. That's where all the rain comes. But as soon as you cross the Cascades and come inland, you're in a desert that extends up into the Okanagan and all the way down to Nevada. So the Nez Perce are some of the people, or Nez Perce, some of the people who live there. Kane met some of them. This is his sketch. When he gets back to the studio in Toronto, this is what he makes of this man. So this is a typical transformation of the subject. Also back at the studio, Kane doesn't really care for anything other than an aesthetic presentation. So if he combines things from garments or something else from another people, who's going to know? He's the authority. And so this is what he concocts here. You see the facial painting. That's very similar in the, and I'll come to bigger blow-ups of it, but red and black. And then the forelock, well, that could be associated with people from Plains Cree all the way over to Nez Perce and not Chinook, not farther down the Columbia. But that was a hair fashion for men, so you can't make much of that. But it's another sketch from which he gets the perforated shirt. And this sketch is called a Rocky Mountain Indian. This sketch is called a nez percé. So this one we seem to get the shirt from legitimately, but not from the other, or not necessarily, unless someone says, oh, that's got to be nez percé, that man too. Here are the comparisons. Now suddenly the guy in the studio has a pierced nose, septum, with a dentalium in it. Now, how did that happen? Is that just because he calls the painting nez percé, pierced nose? If, and this hasn't happened before, if you pay attention to number 91 in the upper left-hand corner of that first sketch called Rocky Mountain Indian, owned by Library and Archives Canada now, you find that it corresponds to this entry in the portrait log down at the bottom, a Spokane on the river of the same name. So now we have, for the first time, this man properly identified. And it's his face painting and a nez percé perforated shirt that come together in the studio canvas. And in my discussion, I quote a source called the Spokane Indians, which talks specifically about red and black pigments, and that with tattooing, the major colors were red and black. And this is a legitimate sketch. Now, Pauline Flett of Spokane, whom I met in 1997, unfortunately, because I didn't get this sorted out until about 18 months ago, died before I was able finally to identify for her that sure enough, yeah, Spokane did paint their faces. There's no other visual evidence of it in the 19th century. This is a good example of how priceless some of Kane's work is from an ethnographic point of view. And so the likelihood that Kane met a Spokane man with a face painted in red and black seems very strong now, given that correspondence with the number 91 and the portrait log entry. But go to the Smithsonian Handbook of North American Indians, and an unimpeachable source, believe me, 16 volumes over the course of maybe 25 years it was produced. And in the entry on nez percé, is it the Kane sketch? No, it's the studio canvas that shows a man with a pierced nose. And this has produced all manner of literature about whether or not nez percé actually pierced their noses. Lewis and Clark, who went down the Columbia in 1804, 1805, they called these people the Chopunish, Chopunish. Didn't mention pierced noses. Where does it come from? If you go back through the record, you find time and again it's wanderings of an artist and Kane's painting that are the source of the information, unimpeachably authoritative. Add to that the fact that wanderings of an artist, and only that stage of the narrative, says that these people are treacherous and villainous, which you see on the right there. So you read that into the painting at this point. This guy is treacherous and villainous as well. As I said, everyone turns into a 5B's Indian at some point. Every chapter has a purple patch, we call this in literary studies, that's exciting, that titillates the reader. And invariably it's Indigenous violence, self-abuse, suicide. It doesn't matter what. The chapter doesn't really end until there's some of that in there. Okay, now what's the repercussion, ramification? I'm showing you a picture of l'Exposition Universelle in Paris in 1855. It followed the sensationally successful Crystal Palace exhibition in London in 1851. Canada had an exhibit in 1855, and the only painter whose works were used were Kane's. So the world came to know Canada in terms of his studio paintings, none of his sketches. It was like showing yourself in public in your underwear to exhibit sketches. That's how Victorians thought. And when Kane showed 240 of them upon returning to Toronto from his travels, every reviewer said these sketches held great promise. Not that they were great, they held great promise, because everyone was waiting for the canvases. And a Torontonian named George William Allen commissioned 100 of them, paid Kane a whopping $20,000 for them. And I don't think there's, to this day, a larger private commission of an artist in Canada, if you translate that into today's dollars. Public commissions, yes, but not private ones. Okay, in 1857, so 2 years before the book comes out, Daniel Wilson, a Scottish professor at the University of Ontario, University of Toronto, who has befriended Kane, takes him to Montreal. I promised you if we get here. It held the 11th meeting of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, first time the AAAS was meeting outside the USA. And so the local organizing committee included Dawson, who'd just become the president of McGill, and he was a good friend of Wilson's. So Wilson vouched for Kane in all respects. I think Kane told him all kinds of stories. Some of them were true. But Wilson, in his unprecedentedly successful book, Prehistoric Man, repeatedly quotes what Kane's told him. So then you have to ask, okay, how about the basis of that and all the influence Prehistoric Man had? What about all of that, given that it just comes because Kane told them? So the conference, which had 445 delegates, met in the brand new Marché Bon Secours and in the Palais de Justice over the course of a week. And Kane presented his work 4 times, either to parts of or the entire conference. It started with the Natural History Society of Montreal sponsoring a soirée the night before it opened, and 1,000 people attended. And the focal point of the evening was Kane's 33 of his canvases that he painted for Allen, he brought down to Montreal. And it was only them, no sketches, that he showed. And he spoke to them at this prestigious assembly. I mean, the AAS still publishes science today. It's the big science journal, and it's you know, it held that authority and it preeminence in Kane's day. So who are we dealing with Paul Kane? He lost control or ceded control of his narrative, and he wasn't beyond turning sketches into something that was aesthetically rather than ethno-historically. Maybe you can't blame him. Ethnohistory didn't exist and anthropology was just getting going. But given that excerpts of Wanderings of an Artist were in school textbooks for decades, and that Kane's paintings, canvases, which is what the Royal Ontario owns, were on the walls of that museum. They started the museum. They were the only art collection in 1912 when that museum opened. So in my day growing up in Toronto, all school kids were paraded down to the ROM and past these walls. These were the Indians that I knew, that I learned about and from. And Wanderings of an Artist had the same enormously wide influence on the way people came to understand Indigenous people. So I tell that story in this book, and I thank you for your attention.
Well, on behalf of the Atwater Library and Computer Center, and of course our Executive Director, Lynn Verge, we would like to thank you, Monsieur Ian, for sharing your time and expertise with us today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, we will now start with our Q&A. I think we have a couple of minutes for that, and we encourage also our Zoom people or attendees to also type in your questions over the chat. I'll be with you in a moment.
That was wonderful, thank you. Well worth all the decades you put into it. But I was intrigued by, I think it was your first slide, where we saw the editorial emendation with a reference to Bacchus. Kane may not have been educated, but a lot of these men would have had classical educations. Were any of them aware that they were looking at a culture that was much closer to Homeric Greece than their own culture was, an animist society with secret cults and beliefs that...
Well, I think Enlightenment's fascination with neoclassicism did two things. One was keep awareness of Greek culture alive, but also distance, well, let's just take the UK, English society, from that culture. We've come so far from it. Yes, they were civilized for their time. Look who we are now. We've built on that. We're much more than that. So we're never going to go back to it. Canon John Douglas, who did the ghostwriting for Captain Cook's second and third voyage narratives, he said that coming to North America with missionaries was vital because the Romans did it for us. Who would we have been if the Romans hadn't come to Great Britain? So we owe it. And you know, the Great Commission at the end of Luke is go out, save souls, tell them the good news. And that was done. That was done, and to some good effect. I mean, there's a disproportionate number of Christians in Canada are Indigenous, far higher than in the population generally. But they're very spiritual people generally. I didn't answer your question, I went away from it, but it was a good question. Margaret, just a sec, the mic has to reach you. Or people on Zoom, and thank you for attending, people on Zoom won't hear you.
You said that you'd been living with Paul Kane since 1987. How did you become interested in him to start with?
Well, as you might guess from the opening remarks, I studied the genre of exploration and travel writing a great deal. It's a genre in English studies. I had this split appointment between English and history. In history, these things are treated as documents, so disabusing historians and anthropologists of the authenticity and authority of a travel narrative is some of the work that I try to do over the course of my career. But generally, I studied that genre. So I did a lot of work, for example, on Mungo Park in West Africa, because his narrative is, at some point, he's stripped of all his clothes and has nothing but his hat. Well, where are his field notes at that point? and you start asking these impolite, pointed questions about most travelers, and you come to realize that readying an author for print involved several hands, if not many. And they tended to go back. There aren't too many examples in Wandering as an Artist, but there's at least two where passages from other books are just lifted and set into Wanderings. So it's an industry. And everyone was a reader. I mean, publishers could make a lot of money in Victorian times, and did. So yeah, it's been very educational for me to keep coming across examples. But as I said at the outset, there are very few cases where three stages exist.
Okay. Did you find any evidence of how much Paul Kane may have initiated or even agreed to these shadings in his original narrative in the field notes?
There's very little correspondence from Kane. There are a few letters during the course of his travels, but Janet Masson, a forensic documents examiner in Houston, Texas, who worked for the FBI for many years, she helped me a great deal in identifying that even those letters aren't written in Kane's hand. And nothing subsequent to his travels, nothing. He died in 1871, and if there were manuscripts and so on, they didn't survive his wife's death in 1891. So yeah, the mystery helps keep Kane a mystery.
One last question.
I'm interested whether the ROM, which seems to have the biggest collection of the finished portraits, has expressed any interest either before the publication of your book or since, in at least showing beside the finished works, the sketches with a bit of a sort of notice this?
Some of you probably know that the identity politics of museums at the moment are pretty toxic. The ROM hasn't acknowledged the publication of this book. And my guess is that, well, I know through a back channel that the ROM officially said in 2022 that it was taking down its Kane paintings. I don't know that it's a fact that they have no intention of showing them again, but they aren't on display, any of them on display at the moment. It would probably take, if not cooperation with an Indigenous curator, or not me at all, but just an Indigenous curator, to put together a show like the kind, Gwenda, that you're suggesting would be possible and useful and educational. When Margaret and I go to Whitefish River First Nation next week, I'll make inquiries. One of their members is a prof at York University in Toronto. I think what needs to happen is sometime, when I started this project in '87, people said, why would you bother? And now they're saying, why would you touch it? An old white guy working on a white guy who painted Indians? But I'm not asking you to feel sorry for me. I'm really gratified that the work is complete. With my wife, Margaret, we're both really relieved that it's complete. And any historian worth his salt writes for posterity, so its value, I'm confident, will come clear in time.